The sound of the waves of the Mediterranean Sea was like a sweet lullaby on the hot summer night. The light of the moon illuminated the distant great lighthouse, which was one of the 7 wonders of the world. In the city of Alexandria of Egypt, a man was bent over his desk, intent on reworking his masterpiece. The title, Egyptiaca. It was a comprehensive history of the Kingdom of Egypt. The man's real name has been lost in the mists of time. We know him only by his Greek name, Manetho. It is believed that he was an Egyptian priest who lived during the so-called Ptolemaic Kingdom, an era around the 3rd century BC, when Egypt was dominated by a Greek-speaking elite. You know Cleopatra for sure, right? She was the last of the Ptolemaic rulers. The oil lantern dimly lit the study. It was late in the night. He had been working a lot on this great book, but finally his stylus stopped. The last volume of Egyptiaca had been finally completed. My name is Sarah. Welcome to the Mists of Time. Episode by episode, we are taking a closer look at how the Bronze Age world came to be. But as we are approaching the end of the Old Kingdom of Egypt, I thought it was for the better to have a quick recap about the history of the Nile Valley. Okay, back to ancient Alexandria. Manetho's work is one of the main historical sources for anyone approaching the history of Egypt. Much could be said about him and his books, as this was a time of great cultural turmoil. But this is a story for another time. What we care about right now is how he divided the long Egyptian history. He was the first to introduce the idea of different dynasties. His use of the term dynasties, although, had nothing to do with bloodlines. He tried to analyze any important turning point. For example, if a king moved the royal seat to another city, Manetho thought that some political changes had just happened. Sadly for Manetho, his masterpiece was kind of a flop. So much so that only some fragments of his books have reached us. As it frequently happens in history, Manetho's work was appreciated only several centuries after his death. Slowly but surely, his dynastic model gained a lot of influence. Like those movies that everyone ignores in the beginning, but soon become cult films. But the dynastic system has some limitations. This is why in 1844 the German scholar von Bunsen introduced a new concept. He divided Egyptian history into 3 major phases: Old, Middle, and New Kingdom. This concept was later revised many times, but the basics are still standing to date. Each phase has a so-called intermediate period in between. In our timeline, we are now reaching the first intermediate period, a time when civil war and political chaos descended on the Nile Valley. What Manetho could not know is that before the Kingdom of Egypt was founded, humans had lived in the Nile Valley for millennia. As this period is before Manetho's dynasties, it is called the pre-dynastic era. For millennia, different tribes of nomadic hunters lived in the Nile Valley. Occasionally, they gathered wild barley and wheat, becoming more and more accustomed to domesticating plants and animals. One of those tribes was the people of Nabta Playa, who around the year 7500 BC lived far away from the river Nile. In fact, ancient Egypt wasn't a harsh desert, but it was a dry but occasionally rainy steppe. At Nabta Playa, people developed a peculiar culture based on cattle herding and star observation. Cultural elements that will be kept alive by the generations to come. By the year 6000 BC, the so-called Neolithic Revolution was now in full swing. people stopped being mainly hunters, and farming became more and more important. But around the year 3900 BC, the region became drier. It was a real catastrophic event, and it forced people to move toward the Nile. They settled down on the river banks, creating permanent villages and more complex societies. Archaeologists have found traces of many different cultures. For example, the so-called Badarian culture, whose people made stunning artifacts. Near the modern town of Nakada, where the river Nile makes a big bend, a cultural center rose up. This is where the very ancient Egyptian culture started to make its first shy appearance. Villages of humble reed huts were left behind. In their stead, towns of mass-produced mud bricks were raised. Eventually, the Egyptian writing system appeared. The hieroglyphs, Greek for sacred carving, could now be seen on pottery and tokens. The people of Nakada produced incredible obsidian blades, like the so-called Gebel el-Arak knife. On its handle, the master of animals is represented. This motif was used all over Asia, Africa and Europe for more than 5,000 years. A side note about the Gebel el-Arak knife. The master of animals has a beard and a hat that are influenced by the style of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. Many questions have been made about these early international contacts, but no one has a definitive answer for them. Soon, the area of Nakada became the cultural heart of Egypt, and the local warlords increased their status. We can see one of such leaders on the scorpion mace hat. It's a decorated war mace on which you can see a man wearing the white crown, the symbol of southern Egypt for millennia to come. The man is digging a canal. In this way, he's portrayed as the bringer of life in the arid and dry Nile Valley. The local people used to make cosmetic palettes in order to grind pigments for sacred rituals. They had to be extremely important indeed. Archaeologists have found many of them, one more beautiful than the other, but the one that takes the lion's share is the Narmer palette. On the palette we can see King Narmer. He too is wearing the white crown of southern Egypt. But on the other palette's face, he's wearing the red crown, the symbol of northern Egypt. Narmer unified the Nile Valley, and with him, the pre-dynastic era ended, as in 3150 BC, the first dynasty began. In our episodes, we use the term King of Egypt and Pharaoh in an interchangeable way. It's commonly accepted, but it's not very correct from a historical point of view. In fact, the term pharaoh means house pillar, or simply great house. It was used in the formula great house, may it live, prosper, and be in health. It was a way to call the royal house as a whole. But the term pharaoh becomes a way to refer to the person of the king, only later in Egyptian history. Anyway, the first dynasty was now ruling over Egypt, and no pyramid had been built yet, and temples, palaces and cities were quite modest. The evolution of Egyptian architecture was in fact a very slow process. Around the year 2650 BC, a man named Zoser was now king of Egypt. Manetho says that Zoser was a member of the third dynasty. More than 4 centuries had passed since the unification of the country by Narmer. And Zoser wanted a great funerary monument for himself. The result was the Step Pyramid, the first building of this kind ever to be built. With Zoser, the so-called Old Kingdom had begun. his successors will build incredible pyramids. For example, King Khufu's tomb has been the largest building in the world for millennia. No one truly knows how they built them, but recently a kind of rolling stone mechanism has been proposed. The system is quite ingenious in its simplicity and efficiency. And that's the very definition of good engineering, right? Slowly, the Egyptian royal administration became very complex. The kings had now a great power and immense resources at their disposal. The rulers of the 5th dynasty built huge ships to explore faraway lands. They were looking for new markets where they could buy timber, incense, and other luxury items. The immense wealth the kings of Egypt had gathered enabled them to raise powerful armies. They used this military power to repress rebellions and to fight any foreign enemies. From afar, the old kingdom of Egypt had to seem like an immutable and eternal state, but it was actually quite unstable. In the next episode, we'll see how the country descended into chaos and civil war. Subscribe and hit the bell to not miss it. See you next time in the mists of time.